They never found the letters. That's what made it all worse. 43 men came to Millbrook Inn over the span of 4 decades, each one leaving behind a trunk, a journal, or a pipe, still warm in the hearth, but no letters, no postcards, home, no receipts. As though the inn had erased their intentions the moment they crossed its porch. In an old ledger now kept in the historical archives of Pendleton County, there is a gap in handwriting. 43 blank lines surrounded by other neat names in ink, all written by the same hand. A different one had started those 43, neater, more delicate, but every single name had been scrubbed out by ink and rain and time. Millbrook Inn still stands, barely, swallowed by the green weight of vines and years of Kentucky storms. No one goes near it now, though once it was the crown jewel of the river towns, built from walnut beams, wrapped in balconies full of music and fine food. At the center of it all were the Cunningham sisters, Virginia and Eloise, 2 women known not just for their beauty, but for what people called their hearts of honey. Generous, kind, gentle to strangers, especially the lonely ones, and that, they would later whisper, was the problem. The tale begins in spring, when the river was still swollen from frost, and the smell of wet bark hung heavy across the hillside. Traders came through the county on horseback, their boots still stained from Tennessee roads. Millbrook welcomed them, gave them supper, music, and warm sheets. They often stayed longer than planned. One man, traveling preacher Elijah Trent, was the first to make mention of the garden. Not the rose garden out front, but the patch of uneven soil out back where nothing quite seemed to grow. He said he'd seen the elder sister, Virginia, kneeling there at dawn, not planting but listening, head tilted, hands muddy, as though something below was whispering up. He told the barkeep in town. 2 weeks later, he vanished. The official story said he'd left for Alabama, but his satchel was never recovered. His Bible was found beneath the stairs, and the name Elijah Trent was carved faintly, only visible in certain light, on the underside of the fireplace stone. They wouldn't discover the others until decades later, when flood damage forced excavation behind the inn. By then, the sisters were long gone, buried under their maiden names. No family ever claimed them. But the earth behind the house, what locals had long called the soft patch, wasn't just soft. It was disturbed, shallow, stained. The first bones were found just 4 inches below the roots, a boot still laced. A jawbone turned slightly as if listening to the house. They dug. Then they stopped. Not because they ran out of earth, but because the count reached 43. 43 separate men, none of them claimed, all found facing the house. And the letters, still missing. Only the sisters wrote things down. Only the sisters kept names. And when they did, they carved them where no one would think to look. On the brick lip inside the inn's fireplace were etched 19 names, deep enough to withstand a century of flame. The rest? Scholars believe they were scratched into the floorboards beneath the guest beds. But the floors were long since eaten by termites and heat. Gone now. Like the men, except the dreams. Locals still speak of them. People camping within a mile of the inn report hearing voices at night. Some say they dream of rooms they've never seen, of white gloves folded neatly on a nightstand, of fingers brushing their collarbone in the dark, not roughly, but like someone who missed you too long. The dreams always end the same. You feel the dirt first, you smell the soil, and then something grabs. Not violently, but slowly. Like affection curdling. Like someone who was once gentle, learning to hold too long. The Cunningham sisters didn't come from money, but they came from beauty. That was enough. In 1831, a trader named Patrick Wilkes wrote of a boarding house run by two women of heavenly face and manner, both still unmarried, yet motherly in kindness. That boarding house would become Millbrook Inn. Their father, Amos Cunningham, had died during a fever epidemic, and their mother, Martha, followed 6 months later. That left the two girls, Virginia, 24, and Eloise, 21, alone on the land with their family's modest inheritance and a home far too large for two. Millbrook back then was nothing but a junction near the Licking River, a place where wagons broke down and men drank to forget what lay downriver. The inn was a blessing: warm food, 3 bedrooms, clean linens, and 2 sisters who seemed to live solely for the comfort of others. But there was something else that began to creep into those early guest accounts, something small, almost invisible, at first. A trader from Memphis noted how the sisters never seemed to sleep. A retired cavalry scout described hearing the soft creak of floorboards outside my door, all night, every night. One man, who left the inn early, said he woke to find Eloise seated at the foot of his bed, hands clasped, as if in prayer. When he blinked, she was gone, but her chair still rocked gently by the fireplace. They never married, which wouldn't have been odd except for how many suitors tried. It wasn't beauty that seduced men at Millbrook. It was the weight of attention, the way Virginia remembered every guest's favorite color, the way Eloise laughed, slightly off rhythm, as if it mattered more that you felt heard than that she understood the joke. People fell in love with them, not in passing, not politely, obsessively. A letter from 1834, preserved in an exhibit at the Pendleton Historical Society, describes the account of Silas Roan, a farm tool salesman from Georgia. He arrived at the inn on a Thursday, and by Friday evening had composed a letter to his wife, asking forgiveness, but announcing his intent to stay. He wrote, "I have never known affection until now. I have never been seen until now. The sisters, they make you feel as though you've always belonged here, that you were meant to be here." Silas was never seen again. His trunk remained in the room until 1842, when it was quietly removed during renovations. His letter was never sent. It was found decades later beneath a warped floorboard. The renovations weren't for cosmetic reasons. By 1839, there were complaints, unspoken at first, glances from men at the tavern who remembered friends who'd never come back through. Hushed comments about a carriage driver who'd stayed too long and whose horse was found weeks later, skeletal and wild-eyed, galloping through an orchard 15 miles south. But nothing ever stuck, because nothing was ever seen, and because the sisters were always so very kind. When Sheriff Elam Dougherty finally questioned them about a missing blacksmith named Edwin Mott, Virginia responded with a letter written in perfect copperplate. She explained that the man had departed early, long before breakfast, and that, as is our custom, we do not retain payment from those who must leave before their stay is done. The sheriff dropped the matter. He even praised their character in his notes. But Edwin's name would later be found, carved into the brick of the hearth, hidden by soot and time. 19 names, etched with a delicate hand, all facing the room, all spelling men who never returned. It was never about killing. That was too crude, too obvious. It was about holding, about possession masquerading as hospitality, about the slow, soft horror of being wanted so thoroughly you were never allowed to leave. Even after death, there were no bloodstains, no screams, just the creaking of a stair at night, a meal placed quietly by your door, a pair of eyes that didn't blink often enough. They didn't drag their victims. They sat with them, slept beside them, cared for them until something inside the men gave way. And when the light left their eyes, the sisters would cry. Then they would dig. In spring of 1840, something shifted at Millbrook Inn. The sisters began turning guests away. Not all of them. just the ones who didn't stay long. The salesmen, the travelers passing through, the ones with eyes that drifted when they spoke. Those types were politely redirected to the stables outside of town. But men who looked lonely, men who lingered in the parlor just a little longer than they should, they were welcomed inside with arms too open, smiles a little too knowing. There were whispers by then. Quiet ones. The kind that never make it into ledgers but live in taverns and creekside murmurs. Whispers about how the sisters seemed ageless despite the passing years. About how the rooms at Millbrook always smelled of fresh linens and, strangely, rosewater, even in the dead of winter. About how the hands of Virginia and Eloise never showed a single callus, though they ran the entire inn by themselves. A man named Timothy Leach tried to leave Millbrook Inn at midnight after just one night's stay. The story goes that he packed, without a sound, didn't even touch the water basin, didn't make the bed. But as he reached the top stair, something warm wrapped around his ankle. Not tight, not painful, just warm, human. When he looked back, no one was there. Leach never made it out. He was found 3 days later by a field hand down by the Licking River, barefoot and muttering. His boots were never recovered. When asked what had happened, he simply said, "They wouldn't let me forget. They kept whispering what I wanted." Then he scratched at his ear until blood trickled down his cheek. Local authorities wrote it off as stress, heat, delirium. The sisters offered prayers at the church on his behalf, hands folded so perfectly you'd think they were mourning a brother. The whispers grew legs after that. A pattern became visible, just barely. Most of the men who went missing had stayed longer than expected, had written notes about how strange it felt to feel so comforted, so known, so forgiven. Forgiven for what? That question would haunt every page of the eventual Ashgrove inquiry when the state finally turned its eyes toward the inn in 1849. But long before then, the townspeople had already stopped looking the sisters in the eye. They crossed the street when they walked to the post. They avoided the porch where the two women sat for hours, always watching the road, as if waiting for someone to return, or perhaps not to. There's an unsettling detail in the journals of a boy named Emmett Green, who lived just down the hill. He was 12, and his mother did laundry for the sisters once a week. He wrote, "I watched the older one, Miss Virginia, brushing a man's coat in the parlor. He wasn't wearing it. He wasn't even there. She looked at the air like he was sitting, smiling, brushing the sleeve again and again like it was made of gold. She looked so proud of it." He wrote this without fear, without understanding. That's what made it worse. But what made it terrifying was what he saw 3 days later. There was a man in the garden, half buried. He was smiling too. His boots were backwards. The townspeople began counting. First in their minds, then in whispers, then in hard numbers. There were too many guests who never left. At first, they wondered if the sisters were hiding bodies beneath the inn. But what they found, years later when the truth was finally exhumed, was far stranger. There were graves, 43 of them, each shallow, neat, lovingly marked with small wooden tokens that had long since rotted. But the remains inside were not broken, no wounds, no violence, just silence. The kind of silence that settles into bones. The kind that speaks of people who gave up, not because they were forced, but because they believed they were home, because someone loved them so much, they forgot to leave. There was one grave without a name. Inside was a man still wearing his wedding ring. A ring that was later confirmed by a widow 2 counties over who had searched for him for over a decade. He had written her one last letter before disappearing. It read, "I've found something so rare, so still. I'm not sure I was ever alive before this." At the bottom of the page, in a different hand, feminine, graceful, were 5 words, "You belong to us now." By autumn of 1841, it was no longer enough for the sisters to wait on the porch. They began walking at dusk, just the edges of town at first, never farther than where the dirt road bent toward the blacksmith's barn. They wore lace gloves and long dresses that never seemed to gather dust, even as the wind stirred up the gravel in clouds behind them. No one ever saw their boots leave prints. They never approached. They just walked, watching windows, watching men. And when they returned each evening without fail, the lamplight from the second-story guest room would be lit, even when the inn was empty, even when it should have been empty. Some nights, locals swore they saw 2 silhouettes in that window. Other nights, 3. Once, someone swore they saw a crowd. The Cunninghams had always said their inn had 4 guest rooms, but they only ever allowed one man to stay at a time. That had always seemed strange, even before the unease set in, but now it felt intentional. That winter, a traveling gravedigger named Rupert Niles came through. He was on no one's ledger, didn't sign the town registry, just passed through the hills and was seen leading his donkey cart with no coffin in it. A week later, his cart was found abandoned behind the inn. The Cunninghams claimed he had only stayed for dinner, that he was headed toward Elk Ridge. But a week later, children playing in the stream behind the orchard found something in the mud. Not a bone, not a boot, a glove. White, silk, stiffened by river water. And inside the glove, the bones of Rupert Niles's hand, still curled, as if gripping something, or resisting, or reaching back. That's when folks began whispering the word. No one wanted to say out loud, not witch, not spirit, but longing, as if the sisters ached for something, as if their love was not a performance, but a sickness that had found its shape. At night, guests began reporting strange things. Long caresses in the dark when no one was in the room. The scent of lilac on their collars in the morning, even when they locked their doors. One man awoke to find 2 fingerprints on his neck, not from strangulation, but as though someone had gently turned his head in his sleep. Toward the window, toward the garden. Some began calling it the softness. That was the name used in hushed barroom corners, passed with unease. The softness got to him. He's been touched, because once a man felt it, he never left town. A teacher from Illinois abandoned his post. A minister on his way to Memphis vanished from his parish registry. A railroad surveyor who had only planned to stay one night was later found living in a shed near the Millbrook garden, mumbling to himself, digging with a soup spoon at the roots of the lilac bush. When questioned, he said, "I can hear her in the walls. She's not finished loving me." It wasn't the sister's beauty that kept men there. That's what people eventually admitted. It was the need. The men didn't run. They didn't scream. They stayed. And when they stayed long enough, something about them began to change. Not their bodies, their posture, the way their eyes drifted upward at nothing, the way they flinched when someone said their names, as if the sound of a voice that wasn't hers caused pain. When a family tried to rescue their cousin, a merchant who had written strange love letters with no return address, they found him wandering barefoot in the orchard at 2 a.m., whispering to the trees. When he saw them, he screamed, "You'll make her stop touching me! Please, don't take her hands away!" That was when they started to dig. It wasn't a mob, exactly. Just 6 men with lanterns and fear so large it turned to urgency. They waited until the sisters left for church, then entered the garden. What? They found beneath the rose beds were not bones at first, but bundles, shrouds of linen, wrapped tightly around full sets of clothes, shoes, wallets, rings, belongings, laid out like offerings, folded like the dead had been prepared, but taken before the body cooled, and deeper, the graves. 43. Only 5 were exhumed before the sheriff arrived. but that was enough. Each body was whole, not decomposed but preserved, not embalmed but soft, as if sleeping. Everyone had their hands folded across their chest, their mouths slightly open, lips damp. Each wore a single white rose in their breast pocket, and none of them, not one, bore signs of violence, as if they had willingly laid down in the arms of something that whispered, coaxed, adored them until their hearts stopped. Not murder, devotion. When the exhumations were halted, the sheriff did what no one expected. He sent the bodies back underground. He said it was respect, said it was forensics, said the town had no coroner. But he never told anyone that during the brief time the bodies were exposed, a strange humidity settled over the garden. Though it was a dry September day, the flowers wilted in minutes. His men complained of whispers inside their teeth. One man bit his own tongue in half trying to silence them. That night, the sheriff went to the inn, alone. He wasn't seen again. But the next morning, the lamplight in the second-story guest window was glowing faintly, flickering, as if someone inside couldn't decide if they wanted to be seen. The town didn't rise up. No one burned the inn. No one condemned the sisters. Instead, Millbrook fell into a kind of truce, an exhausted, unspoken silence, a place where everyone simply decided not to look too closely, not to ask who the new stranger was coming up the lane, not to speak the names of the missing, and especially not to go near the garden fence when the wind was high, because that's when the roses whispered. The softness by now had begun to bleed into the land. Old women who passed the orchard on their way to church said their legs began to feel heavy, not from age, but from something pulling at their ankles, gently, like a child who wanted to be held. Children who dared each other to sneak into the root cellar beneath the inn came back pale, unable to speak for hours. One girl simply drew a single shape in the dirt, over and over, an open mouth and a hand reaching toward it. By the spring of 1842, the postmaster was keeping track of arrivals, of departures, and what he discovered chilled him. Visitors arrived, weekly. Men, mostly. All from distant places, all with vague reasons. A traveling clockmaker, a widowed preacher, a man from Boston who said he was searching for a place that felt like home. They stayed one night, maybe two. Then nothing. They didn't leave by the roads. Their names vanished from record, but always, within 3 days of their visit, a new rose bush bloomed in the Millbrook garden, and every bush had a small wooden placard beside it. Each one hand carved, with a name. The town began walking faster past the inn, crossed the road without looking, spoke with their eyes low, because by then they all knew something unspeakable. The garden was growing, and so was the softness. By summer, it was no longer limited to men. A young woman from Charleston disappeared after playing piano for the sisters. A farmer's wife went missing for 3 days, then returned, silent, and slept standing up in her kitchen for weeks. Then came the school teacher. She had been loved in town, gentle, bright, quick to laugh, but she made the mistake of looking the sisters in the eyes. Too long, perhaps. Or perhaps she recognized something that smiled with her own mouth. When they found her, she was not dead. She had buried herself up to her waist in the garden soil. Not frantically, but neatly, her hands folded in her lap, her lips parted, smiling. A white rose behind one ear, and when they pulled her out, she began to scream. Not words, but names. 19 of them, all men, all strangers. All the names found later, carved faintly along the inside wall of the inn's hearth, just beneath. The soot, where a certain light could catch the grooves. They were not prayers. They were not victims. They were loved. Each name etched with care, as if each was the answer to a question the sisters never stopped asking. Who will stay? Somewhere between the cellar floorboards and the inn's warped second-story banister, there was a change in the air, not a shift in temperature, not a draft, but a sensation that crept over you like steam in a sealed room. It didn't just cling, it wrapped, like breath, like skin, like the warmth of another person just behind you, a hand on your shoulder, a mouth close enough to mistake for your own thought. By 1844, the softness the townsfolk once whispered about had grown tactile. It had fingers. You didn't feel them in broad daylight. The inn had grown clever, or maybe the sisters simply preferred a kind of courtship. Their touch came in stages, slow, polite, like a dance, a thumb brushing your cufflink, a palm gently pressing between your shoulder blades, urging you upstairs, toward the room with the lace-curtained windows and the faint scent of lilac rot. But once inside, once the guest agreed to stay the night, it changed. And they changed. It began with the floorboards. People who spent nights there spoke of sudden weight, not over them, but under, beneath the mattress, beneath the rug. A subtle push, like something under the bed had grown upward, not violently, not with force, but with intention. It wanted to rise. It wanted you to lie still. And most guests did. A traveling lawyer who stayed in room 3 claimed he woke in the middle of the night and could not move. Not for lack of trying, but because he felt held. He described it in his journal as tender hands, not many, just 2, gently urging me back down whenever I attempted to sit. He said they were firm, but not cruel, and warm. Far warmer than a human body should be in the cold of that house. He left the next morning. 2 months later, a rose bloomed in the garden with his name. But that was the subtle version. Other accounts, preserved only in hushed retellings and a sheriff's pocket diary found years later, were far worse. The innkeeper's boy, the last of the original staff, went blind after accidentally stepping into the locked pantry and discovering a softness that grasped him by the cheeks and whispered through his teeth in a voice he swore was his late mother's. A peddler once tried to resist. He was found not in the bed but on the roof, bent backward over the peak, his mouth stuffed with rose petals, his feet buried in the shingles. His hands had been removed, not torn, not cut, unmade. One constable, a young man with ambition and no sense of history, decided to investigate the basement in 1846. He got to the door. Just the door. And that's when it happened. He turned to leave, but his legs didn't follow. He collapsed, not screaming but shaking, whispering. Witnesses said it looked like he was trying to rise, again and again, but something was wrapping around his spine, bending him backward. Not breaking, just gently folding. His final words before he vanished. They are not pulling, they are inviting. The sisters watched from the upstairs window, motionless, one hand on the curtain, one hand gently resting on the sill, palm down, fingers moving as if brushing back the hair of someone kneeling just below. And the townspeople? They stopped coming entirely. By the winter of 1847, no one delivered food. No one rode the lane. The postmaster's ledgers ended. Visitors still came, yes, but they didn't come from Millbrook. They came from elsewhere, alone, men with no attachments, women who wore black even when it wasn't mourning season, missionaries, story collectors, debtors, always alone and always pulled, or rather, invited, one by one, each drawn by the legend of the sisters, who were said to offer not sin, not horror, not pain, but something worse, love without end. A love you couldn't walk away from, a love that gently wrapped around your ribs and held you when no one else would. A love that whispered beneath the floorboards, And the earth behind Millbrook Inn had never been rich. It was dry and pale, and even the weeds grew in crooked angles, like bones that had never healed properly. But by the end of 1847, something beneath it had shifted. The roots deepened, the roses grew thicker, the ground itself began to sweat, not with water, but with a strange, sweet perfume that wafted into the air only after nightfall. There were 43 headstones now, each unmarked, each the same height, each resting at an angle, not from decay, but as if something underneath had risen, pushing gently against the slab, asking to be seen. The sisters had not been seen in weeks. Their windows remained lit. Meals were still left out on the porch and returned empty by dawn, and on the first Sunday of December, a child from the village claimed he saw Miss Anne's face in the second-floor window. But not her body, only her face, floating in shadow, mouth slightly open, as if waiting to whisper a name. He said her eyes weren't looking at him. They were fixed on something inside the room, just below her. That same night, the front door of the inn creaked open on its own. No one walked in. No one walked out. But the smell, it was different now, not the lilacs. Not even the iron scent of tilled Kentucky soil. It smelled like someone familiar. Someone who had once held your hand through the worst night of your life and said it would be okay. Someone whose voice you'd forgotten, but who never forgot yours. It smelled like them, as if they were just inside, waiting, still warm. That scent lasted until morning. Then it vanished, and the shutters closed again. In the years that followed, the inn stood untouched, weathered, but not broken, dusty, but never truly abandoned. Like a house caught mid-breath, holding a moment between inhale and exhale, waiting for its next visitor. The property was never resold. No family claimed the land. No cousin or nephew ever wrote in to demand the belongings of Sisters Anne and Lillian Cunningham. But someone tended the graves. The roses never wilted, not once. And sometimes, if you passed close enough to the cemetery fence just after dusk, you'd see something standing in the garden. Not a woman, not a ghost. Something in between. A silhouette with long hair and a dress heavy enough to hide movement but never sound. You'd hear the tendril scratch of fingertips brushing over a headstone, the gentle scooping of soil being rearranged, the low, breathless murmur of a name being repeated. Not spoken aloud, but shared, given. And sometimes, if you stood still long enough, it would stop tending and turn toward you. Not with malice, not with hunger, but with hope. A quiet, dreadful hope that you were finally ready to stay. And if you took one step forward, the wind would shift. Behind you, the gate would creak, and the hands, those warm, unhurried hands, would begin to reach from beneath the roots, not to drag, not to seize, but to hold, to wrap, to invite you down, gently, slowly, lovingly, as they had with all the others, because no one was ever forced at Millbrook Inn. They were only loved, and loved, as the sisters knew, was always enough, even unto the grave, then climbed up,